With Babylon 5, though, you also have unauthorized guides, unofficial guides that take more of a tongue-in-cheek approach, a fan's approach to the series, not necessarily always being so glowing. Those original guidebooks that I showed you when I showed you the DVD season sets, those include summaries of the episodes and interviews and things like that. If you want to get to the nitty-gritty, first appearances, odd bits of technology, wait a second, this part of the episode didn't make sense, stuff like that, you need an unauthorized guide like The Babylon File, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Another excellent series. In fact, this is probably the single best guidebook series of any kind for any series out there as far as usefulness when you're watching stuff. I love this series. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover everything because it was published only after the end of Babylon 5 itself, but it is an excellent series. One can only hope that someday they'll make one for Crusade, Legends of the Rangers, and so forth. Again, The Babylon File by Andy Lane. Well, there are fans out there keeping track of Babylon 5 chronologically, just like I do with the Star Wars Timeline Gold. Only what they wound up doing for Babylon 5 was they literally had two of the biggest and best fandom timelines for Babylon 5 and allowed them to be authorized and published as Babylon 5, Across Time and Space, The Chronologies of Babylon 5, authorized by J. Michael Straczynski. It's a little pricey, a little tougher to come by, available online originally, but it literally is a fandom chronology, like, say, the Star Wars Timeline Gold for Babylon 5, two of them, actually, combined and officially published with the thumbs up of the author. Really, really awesome. Just like Star Wars, of course, Babylon 5 also has its behind-the-scenes guides, which is not going to be really the focus of our stuff here. We're not really going to look at behind-the-scenes of Revenge of the Sith or anything like that. But in that same larger format, they had guides like the Babylon 5 Security Manual, a guide in-universe to technology, events, weapons, factions, and so forth. This is a kind of guide most people are most familiar with when it comes to Star Wars. In Star Wars, we'd call a guide like this an essential guide. Now, as an end note here, before we move on to talk about the Star Wars guidebooks in the next part, I would be remiss when talking about Babylon 5 and J. Michael Straczynski if I didn't take a moment to recommend something else to you completely not related to guidebooks. That is his comic book series, Rising Stars. It really is the type of story that Heroes on television should have been. In fact, there were a lot of parallels drawn between Heroes and Rising Stars, perhaps even suggesting that Heroes borrowed from Rising Stars. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it's that type of story. What if superheroes were real, so to speak, and superheroes had more than just their superheroic lives? What about the interactions between them, personal relationships? It's really a good, epic story, and now you can get the whole thing in a special omnibus edition called the Rising Stars Compendium. Now, the series itself had a 0 issue, a 1/2 issue, a special story, and a reprint of, I think it was either the 0 or the 1/2 issue. You had a prelude issue. You had 24 regular issues, 3 acts of 8 issues each. You had the Voices of the Dead miniseries, which I think was 6 issues, the Bright miniseries, 3 issues, the Untouchable miniseries, 5 issues, and this includes all of those, the entire franchise, not just an entire mini-series or an entire regular series, but an entire franchise here in one gigantic omnibus edition. $60 cover price. You can usually find it cheaper on places like Amazon. This is an amazing series. If you like superhero stories, if you were into Heroes, especially the first season, not as it sort of tapered off those last few seasons, definitely check out Rising Stars. You won't regret it. It's one of my favorite comic book series ever.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope. Or I'll beat you with my boomstick. Yeah.
You know, ever since those words were spoken in A New Hope by, well, a much more feminine character than Yuuzhan Vong Bob here, we've been looking for guidance in Star Wars, one way or the other. Whether it's to find Obi-Wan Kenobi and get those plans to Alderaan before it goes kerblooey, or a reader trying to figure out what to read next, we've been looking for guidance within the Star Wars universe, and for readers of the expanded universe, there's a lot of great guidebook material out there. We've taken a look in the first part of this back at the idea of guidebooks from other franchises. You probably noticed a few different approaches. One is that guidebooks a lot of times don't include everything, because oftentimes they're published, as in the case of, say, Left Behind or The Babylon File, they're published around the time that the popularity of a franchise reaches its height. But there may still be more coming out that won't wind up inside that guidebook. Another great example of this that was cut for time from Part 1 is the book Approaching the Possible, which is a guide for the Stargate franchise that only covers the first 8 seasons of SG-1. Out of 10 of SG-1, 5 of Atlantis, 2 of Universe, plus the Stargate Infinity cartoon. If you think I'm joking about that song, look up the Stargate Infinity cartoon series opening theme on YouTube sometime. It really was that bad without the finger snapping. So, we know that sometimes guidebooks fall short because they can't be updated immediately. They take time to publish. They're always going to be a little bit out of date. That's just sort of the nature of the beast here. We've also found that there are different approaches when it comes to who actually publishes these guidebooks. Sometimes they're official, sometimes unofficial. Good example of this being when we looked back at Babylon 5. The Babylon File was unofficial. I found it more useful. Prime Targets for Transformers was also in that vein. But with Babylon 5, the season guides I showed you when I showed you the DVD sets were official guidebooks. Lots of great behind-the-scenes information, not necessarily as nitpicky because of the approach taken by Jane Killick, the author of that series. So you got a lot of different approaches. You also have approaches that break down episodes in sort of an episodic nitpicky fashion, like the Babylon File does, or Prime Targets does, or its companion for G.I. Joe, Now You Know. Or you have things that are essentially encyclopedias, like what we saw with A to Z of Babylon 5, or a hybrid of episode guide and encyclopedia, like the Quantum Leap A to Z guide. So there's a lot of different approaches being taken. With Star Wars, there's basically been 3 main lines of guidebooks outside of the role-playing game materials that we tend to focus upon. We have the Guide to the Star Wars Universe, which had 3 editions, and we have the Essential Guides, which is probably the most well-known of these lines, that has gone through 3 different iterations, and we have the Complete Star Wars Encyclopedia and its predecessor, which is granted only 2 versions, but that second version has 3 different volumes to it. So again, we're looking at things in threes. 3, 3, and 3. A trilogy of trilogies. Much like Lucas at one time said the films were going to be before he said it was always meant to be 6. Of course, before that it was going to be 12, starting with A New Hope, but let's not even remotely try to get into that topic again. So, what we want to do is take a look here in this second part at the Star Wars guidebooks and their overall evolution. What are there out there if you want to pick them up? Now, I'm not going to go through for each one of these and give you all kinds of vital statistics. For those, take a look down at the bottom of your screen, like right around in here or so, as I look at my webcam, right around in here or so, you're going to find subtitles popping up, as they usually do. In each case, it'll tell you the name of the guidebook, the date it was published, as far as what year at least, the author or authors of that guidebook, and if there's anything else specific that needs to be mentioned, it will be mentioned there. We want to focus on the evolution of this series and what exists for those of you who are curious about it, especially if you're newer to the EU, you may be reading the books, reading the comics, but not delving into guidebooks yet. The first guidebooks we want to take a look at are entitled A Guide to the Star Wars Universe, which is kind of funny given the fact that they're called A Guide when, you know, there's 3 of them and tons of other guides out there. But I, at least a little bit, digress here. The first of this line is A Guide to the Star Wars Universe with no edition number. This is, of course, the first edition by Raymond L. Velasco, the only one of the 3 by Velasco. It would jump authors by the second edition 10 years later. Now, this is an unusual one because it was published in 1984, which means it's only early material. In fact, a lot of it's coming from portfolios and articles about the saga, more so in some cases than the saga itself. Art of books, things like that. You have the films, of course, you have early novels like Splinter of the Mind's Eye and such. The Marvel Comics are notably absent in most respects from this particular one. Obviously, we don't have droids or Ewoks yet because those weren't around at that point. It really is a very strange look back into the universe of Star Wars as it existed as of 1984. if for nothing else, that makes it worth checking out if you can get your hands on a copy of this, just for the curiosity's sake from a historical perspective. We have Raymond L. Velasco, A Guide to the Star Wars Universe. It's divided up into sections for devices and things up in the front, alien creatures and species and so forth, and then as you go through the individual pages, they're all mixed together, but it makes it a point of telling you which are which in the front of the book in some of these guide pages. Now, the book itself isn't all that large. It's only a little over 200 pages, but it was the start of a line of books that would continue all the way up until 2000, 16 years later. 10 years later, the Guide to the Star Wars Universe series returned with the second edition. This one not by Velasco. This one is by Bill Slavicsek, who is now one of the lead guys over at Wizards of the Coast as of the time I'm recording this. What they did was they expanded it quite a bit, about 50% new material, or so it is advertised, revised and expanded here. Runs just under 500 pages, whereas the other one was just over 200, so at least double the material, hence the 50% more. Some of the old stuff is edited, but a lot of it is just brand new stuff. And this was published 10 years later in 1994. That means the EU, the modern EU, had been going for about 3 years at this point. So it's going to include all the Marvel stuff, it's going to include all the early Del Rey novels, which makes sense because it's published by Del Rey, just like a lot of the other Star Wars guidebooks have tended to be. And it's got newer EU materials in it, going all the way up through, and this is a big one, whoa, novels. From Star Wars to The Last Command. Whoa! It covered modern EU novels up through, like, the third one. Wow. Or at least the end of the Thrawn trilogy, the first trilogy that was out there. So it's not exactly big on modern EU, but from the standpoint of gathering up all the earlier stuff, it is a great resource here. To be honest with you, I almost wish this had been published in 1990 instead. So it would literally have compiled all the early stuff that this one wound up leaving out by being out in 84 as opposed to after the cartoons and such. So this could be a pure sort of a pre-modern EU tome here. Instead, it sort of is like that because it only has just about 3 years, 4 years give or take of new expanded universe material in it in the Bantam and Dark Horse era. 2000 saw Del Rey return to the Guide to the Star Wars Universe series one last time with the third edition, also by Bill Slavicsek. It was completely revised and expanded. It has new information from The Phantom Menace, but that's about it as far as prequels go. It was published in the year 2000. Now, what makes this kind of weird is that this was just a continuation of that earlier series. It's sort of a very simplistic, little, quick, encyclopedic type book. It's a paperback. It's around 600 pages, give or take. But this was being published in an era when the Essential Guides were already being published. In fact, this was published in the same year as the original version of the Essential Chronology. In fact, it was published 2 years after this bad boy, the original Star Wars Encyclopedia, which we're going to get to here in just a moment. So the existence of this is a bit surprising. That they decided to publish it at all, I guess, is a testament to just that urge for people to pick up Star Wars materials out there. But not a bad series, certainly nothing that can hold a candle to the Essential Guides or the encyclopedias. And to be honest with you, this one I'm not all that interested in compared to the other two because the other ones can be seen as sort of historical tomes looking back on a particular era of Star Wars. This is just basically 2000 on backward. And it's a mixture of the older stuff and the newer stuff that existed for that first decade or so of the EU. If you're looking for that, you might as well look in some of those Essential Guides, because you'll get basically the same information in a bit more colorful format. Yes, this is illustrated, but it's mostly illustrations, in some cases, taken from Essential Guides or from other guidebooks here and there. So I would skip the third. Second one's a pretty decent one to pick up, and I would definitely pick up the first edition just for the historical curiosity of it if you're a long-time Star Wars fan whose fandom goes all the way back to the 80s.